October 1944 was a stark and unforgiving month. The morning air in Iowa was sharp and cold as the first train carrying German women prisoners of war came to a halt at Camp Alona. Steam hissed against the gray sky, creating a veil of mist over the platform as the women slowly disembarked. Their uniforms were worn and ill-fitting, clinging to their bodies as they stepped into a land they had only ever heard about in stories of brutality and death. The long journey from their homeland, filled with uncertainty, had left them with hollow eyes and heavy hearts. They had come expecting hatred, but they were met with an unsettling silence that filled the air. Greta, the de facto leader of the group, stood at the front, her eyes scanning the camp as she took the first steps on American soil. Behind her, the other women shuffled forward, all reluctant to acknowledge the relief that flooded them upon seeing the cleanliness and order of the camp. They had expected a camp like the ones they had heard of in their darkest nightmares, but here everything was strangely calm. The barracks were clean, the grounds were well kept, and there was no sign of the violence they had been promised. It was almost too surreal for them to comprehend. The guards, standing at attention with their rifles slung over their shoulders, did not meet their gaze. They seemed as cautious of the women as the women were of them, maintaining a professional distance. Greta's mind raced, filled with the conflicting images of what they had been led to expect and what they were now experiencing. They had been trained to believe that any place outside of Germany was a place of fear and suffering. But here, in this foreign land, there was no sign of that fear. As they were led to their barracks, Greta noticed the small details: the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, the humming of the camp's machinery, the bright sun casting long shadows over the paths. None of it felt like the brutal punishment they had anticipated. Their surroundings seemed too human. The contradiction made her uneasy. She wondered whether it was a trap or if the Americans had some other sinister plan in mind. Inside their quarters, the women were assigned bunks and told to settle in. The room was Spartan, with nothing more than thin blankets and a few pieces of simple furniture, but it was a far cry from the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions they had expected. They sat down on their beds, still unsure of what to make of the situation. There was no shouting, no forced labor, no cruel punishments, just a cold, impersonal welcome that left them feeling both confused and unsettled. The quiet that settled over the barracks was thick with unspoken questions. No one spoke of the oddness of the place, but the unease hung in the air like a fog. They had been led to believe that survival in an American camp would be a daily fight, a constant reminder of their status as the enemy. But here, there were no such reminders. Their guards were not cruel, their food was plentiful, and the camp, while militarized, had none of the savage undercurrents they had imagined. Greta sat on her cot, trying to process it all. She had been prepared for the worst. She had braced herself for starvation, for violence, for unimaginable suffering. Yet here they were, in a place that, while cold and unfamiliar, did not match the horrors she had been taught to expect. She looked at the others in the room. Some were sitting silently, eyes distant, while others fidgeted nervously, still unsure of what this strange new world would hold. Their shared silence spoke volumes. In the mess hall later that day, they were served their first meal, a humble vegetable soup and a small loaf of bread. The women sat at long wooden tables, each with a tin plate in front of them. As they ate, they exchanged wary glances, still unsure of the intentions behind the food they were given. Greta noted the plainness of the meal, but there was no bitterness in her heart. They were being fed, and that in itself was a strange comfort. It was the first time in a long while that they had been treated like humans and not like animals, left to starve and wait for the next round of punishment. Yet, even as they ate, the foreignness of the experience lingered. The bread, though plain and unremarkable, felt like a symbol of something they couldn't quite grasp. Greta's thoughts wandered back to the stories she had heard about American food, tales of extravagant meals and indulgent portions. She had always imagined that the food in an American camp would be as much of a luxury as the soldiers themselves. But the reality was much simpler. Still, it was enough. For the first time in months, they were being cared for. The silence in the mess hall was broken when Sam Washington, the camp's cook, entered with a new dish. It was something none of them had ever seen before. Pineapple slices and orange juice, served in neat glasses, were placed before them. Greta stared at the bright colors of the fruit, the vivid orange of the juice contrasting sharply with the drab surroundings. She blinked, unsure of how to respond. The sight of such unfamiliar, tropical food left her speechless. What was the meaning of this? Why pineapple and orange juice, something so strange to them? The women looked at each other, confused. Was this some kind of joke? A trick? Had they misunderstood the situation? Greta reached for her glass slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. She took a sip of the juice, feeling the sweetness fill her mouth. For a brief moment, her mind was blank. She had expected hardship, suffering, but instead, she tasted the unfamiliar sweetness of generosity. It didn't make sense. How could the enemy offer something so kind? As the women slowly began to taste the fruit, their laughter was the only thing that broke the quiet tension. It wasn't laughter of joy or humor, but of disbelief. This was not what they had imagined. This was not what they had been told to expect. And yet, it was real. The fruit was real, and so was the kindness in the meal. It was a strange, unsettling kindness, one that they didn't know how to process. Greta took another sip of her juice, her mind still racing. Was this the beginning of something new? Or was it simply another layer of deception? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that, in that moment, nothing was as it seemed. And for the first time in a long while, she began to wonder if this place, this camp, might be the beginning of something she could never have imagined. The next morning, the German women woke to a strange stillness in the air. They had spent the night in their new quarters, each woman lying awake in the dark, processing the bewildering events of the previous day. The camp had been too clean, too calm, and the food had been too generous for it to feel like the enemy's stronghold. Greta sat up in her cot, her eyes scanning the barracks, still unsure of what to make of it all. The other women had not spoken much since the meal, but the silence in the room felt heavy with unspoken questions. Greta felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders as the de facto leader of the group. She knew the women were looking to her for answers, but she had none to give. The reality of their situation was still too strange to comprehend fully. There had been no violence, no mistreatment, nothing that matched the stories they had been told about American captivity. It all seemed wrong. She had expected an atmosphere of fear, a place where they would be pushed to the brink of despair. But here they were, surrounded by calm and care. As they made their way to the mess hall for breakfast, there was an uneasy air among the women. They had all been trained to distrust the enemy, to view them with suspicion at all times. But this was something else entirely. The same sense of disbelief that had washed over them the night before returned as they entered the mess hall and saw the same strange food once again. Pineapple slices, orange juice, and the same unfamiliar, almost absurd kindness. Greta's mind raced. She couldn't understand why they were being treated this way. Had the Americans been taught to believe that kindness would break their will? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being manipulated in some way, but the logic of it didn't hold up. If the Americans wanted to break their spirits, surely the food would be bland, tasteless, something to reflect the hardship they had anticipated. But no, they were served fruit, sweet, tropical fruit. She glanced around the room at the other women. Some had already taken a bite of the pineapple, and though they didn't show it outwardly, they too seemed unsettled. The murmurs around the table grew as the women exchanged cautious glances. The food, once so strange and unfamiliar, now became a symbol of the uncertainty they felt. Greta could see the conflict in their eyes. They were hungry, and their bodies told them to eat, but their minds couldn't quite reconcile the kindness they were being shown with the enemy they had always been taught to fear. Some women ate quietly, almost hesitantly, while others sat with their hands folded in their laps, staring at the food as if it were some kind of trick. Greta herself had not touched the food yet. She had to think, to process. She had spent so many months preparing for the worst, training herself and the others to survive in the most brutal of circumstances. Now, here they were, in a place where there was no violence, no hatred, only a kind of calm acceptance. It made her question everything she had believed about this war, about what it meant to be an enemy, and what it meant to be human. Finally, after a long silence, Greta picked up her fork and hesitantly took a bite of the pineapple. The sweetness surprised her, and for a moment her mind was blank. She chewed slowly, the taste lingering in her mouth as she tried to make sense of it. How could this be? How could the enemy serve something so human? The juice was just as sweet, and she found herself savoring the fruit as if it were something rare, something that hadn't been available to her for a long time. But even as she chewed, she could not shake the sense that it was all too perfect to be true. The other women were beginning to eat as well, but there was no joy in it, only confusion. They were breaking their own rules, doing something they had been trained not to do. They were accepting something from the enemy. Greta noticed one woman, Anna Marie, looking at the orange juice with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. It was the first time since their capture that they had allowed themselves to feel anything other than fear or anger. The fruit, the juice, had done something to them. It had broken down a small but significant barrier between them and the reality of their captivity. Despite the confusion, Greta could see that some of the women were slowly relaxing. They hadn't expected to be treated this way, and their bodies, starved for comfort, were responding to it. For the first time in weeks, they were being given something that wasn't merely a means of survival. It was a gesture of care. It felt wrong, yet it felt right in a way they couldn't explain. But what did it mean? What was the message behind this unexpected kindness? Greta's thoughts were interrupted when the camp commander, a stern man named Sergeant Riley, entered the mess hall. He surveyed the room briefly, noting the uneasy silence among the women. It was clear that they were not used to this kind of treatment. He offered a small, measured smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope you are enjoying the food," he said, his voice polite but firm. "We want to ensure that you are well taken care of here. No harm will come to you." Greta looked up at him, still unsure of how to react. The words, though seemingly reassuring, did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. She glanced at the other women, their eyes filled with uncertainty. No one spoke for a long time, and the quiet that followed Riley's words was thick with the weight of their unanswered questions. The rest of the meal passed in silence. The pineapple and orange juice, once symbols of uncertainty, now sat uneaten by most. It was as if the women couldn't bring themselves to accept what had been offered, even though their bodies told them otherwise. Greta knew that this moment was more than just a simple meal. It was a test. The Americans were testing them, and they were testing themselves. How far could they go before they lost sight of their identity, their sense of who they were? As the meal ended and the women filed out of the mess hall, Greta couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. She had expected this camp to break them down, to crush their spirits. But instead, it was doing something far more dangerous. It was making them question everything they had believed about the enemy, about survival, and about what it meant to be human. The days that followed the meal were filled with confusion. Despite their reluctance to accept the kindness shown to them, the German women couldn't shake the odd feeling that had begun to stir within them. They had arrived in the camp expecting to be treated as enemies, to be subjected to cruelty and harsh conditions. Yet each new day brought more uncertainty. The food, though simple, had been plentiful and nourishing, a sharp contrast to the meager rations they had come to expect. The barracks, while austere, were not overcrowded, and the air was not filled with the oppressive tension they had feared. It was as if they had stepped into a parallel world, one that didn't align with the stories they had been told about what American camps were like. Greta felt the weight of the contradictions more than anyone else. She had spent months preparing herself for the brutality of captivity. She had been taught to expect no mercy, to assume that every moment in the hands of the enemy would be a struggle for survival. But now, here they were, treated with an odd sort of decency. It felt almost like an insult, as if the Americans were trying to prove something to them, perhaps to show that they were not the brutal monsters they had been told to fear. But why then was this so unsettling? Why did it leave a bitter taste in her mouth? At night, when the barracks were quiet and the women lay awake, many of them replayed the events of the day in their minds. Some had eaten the fruit and drank the juice, but many had done so with a sense of guilt, as though they were betraying something by accepting food from their captors. Greta knew that their hesitation was not about the food itself, but about what it represented. To eat this food, to accept it with gratitude, felt like an acknowledgement that they were no longer fully in control of their own fate. It was as though they had been broken by the mere act of being treated with kindness. The internal struggle was evident the next morning. When the women were brought their breakfast, another tray of food appeared. This time, there was no pineapple, no orange juice. Instead, they were given simple oatmeal and bread. The absence of the sweet fruits only deepened the sense of confusion. Some of the women eyed their bowls with suspicion, still reeling from the earlier meal. They had been served the fruit out of what seemed like generosity, but now they were back to the basics, the familiar food they had known throughout the war. In that moment, the oatmeal felt like a symbol of the harsh realities they had been trying to escape. It was practical, but devoid of any warmth. Greta could feel the unease spreading among the women. The food was no longer a luxury, and the realization settled in like a weight on her chest. The Americans were not cruel, but they were also not doing this out of a sense of charity. This wasn't about giving them something special. It was about survival, about making sure they were kept alive, perhaps for some larger purpose that neither she nor the other women could yet comprehend. She wondered if the Americans saw them as nothing more than pawns in a larger game. The women continued to go through the motions of their daily lives. The language barrier was still a struggle, but they had been assigned English lessons, and Greta took it upon herself to organize small study groups. In a way, the lessons became a form of resistance. They weren't just learning a new language, they were asserting their agency in a place where they had none. The lessons gave them a sense of control, however small, over their environment. The food, however, remained an issue. They had not forgotten the pineapple and orange juice, and the discomfort of that meal lingered in the back of their minds. One afternoon, after the group had finished their English lesson, Greta pulled aside a few of the older women. She could see the struggle in their faces, the resistance to accepting the kindness they were being shown. "We cannot continue like this," she said quietly. "We cannot keep pretending that we are not being treated differently from what we expected. Yes, we are captives, but we must also accept that some things are beyond our control now." Her voice was firm, but there was a note of uncertainty in it. She herself wasn't sure what it meant to accept the truth of their situation. The women listened in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Anna Marie, the oldest of the group, spoke first. "But why should we accept kindness from them?" she asked. "How can we be grateful for what they give us when we know what they've done to our country?" Her voice trembled, but there was no malice in it, only the pain of displacement. Greta paused before answering. "I understand your anger," she said softly, "but we are not fighting them anymore. We are here, and the war is no longer in our hands. What we can control is how we react to this. We cannot fight them with hatred, not anymore." The conversation ended without resolution, but it had opened a door. The women began to realize that, despite everything, they could not remain trapped in their hatred. The camp, though strange and unsettling, was not their enemy. The food, no matter how odd, was not a weapon. The real challenge now was how to move forward, how to accept the reality of their captivity while maintaining some sense of dignity. In the coming days, the women began to interact more with the American guards. The cautious distance that had marked their early encounters began to lessen. It wasn't a friendship, but it was a step toward mutual respect. Greta found herself caught between two worlds: the world she had known, where enemies were to be despised, and the world she was now part of, where survival meant finding a way to coexist, however reluctantly, with those who had once been the enemy. She didn't have the answers, but she knew that something had to change. The fruit, the juice, the food they had been given, it wasn't just a meal. It was a reminder of the complexity of their situation. They weren't just prisoners. They were women, human beings, caught in a web of circumstances beyond their control. The struggle wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding what it meant to be human in a world at war. Greta knew they were all still learning what that meant. As the days wore on, the initial confusion began to give way to a deeper realization. The strange kindness that had once felt so foreign was now starting to settle into their lives in ways that none of the women had expected. Greta, who had been so quick to dismiss the comfort of the fruit and the generosity behind it, now found herself wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just the food that had thrown them off, it was everything that had come with it. The care, the consideration, the basic human decency extended to them by people they had been taught to hate. How could she reconcile this with the years of indoctrination that had taught her to see the enemy as something less than human? The discomfort was most apparent when the women gathered in their barracks at night. It was the one time of day when they could speak freely, away from the watchful eyes of the guards. But even then, the silence was heavy. Greta could feel the unease settling in like a weight on her chest. The other women, though they had not said much, were clearly struggling with the same questions. How were they supposed to react to kindness from the people they had been told were their oppressors? How could they acknowledge it without betraying their country, their families, and everything they had believed in? One night, as they sat around in their barracks, the issue came to a head. Anna Marie, who had been quiet for days, finally spoke up. "I can't shake the feeling that we've lost something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We came here as prisoners, yes, but we also came with pride, with the belief that we were fighting for something greater. And now, it feels as though we are losing that, bit by bit. We are being treated with respect, with kindness, and I don't know how to handle it." Greta listened quietly, her mind swirling with her own doubts. She had felt the same thing. In the beginning, she had seen their captivity as a battle of wills, a fight for survival in a hostile land. But as the days passed, as they were given food and shelter, she began to wonder whether they were becoming something else, something they weren't ready to be. Could they still maintain their pride while accepting the generosity of their captors? Was it even possible to remain the same after being treated like human beings instead of animals? She looked around the room at the other women, their faces etched with the same conflict. It was clear that they were all grappling with the same problem, each in their own way. Some had begun to accept the food with a quiet grace, while others, like Anna Marie, refused to touch it. Greta knew that this division was not just about the fruit or the meal. It was about something deeper. It was about what it meant to be a prisoner and how much of themselves they were willing to surrender in order to survive. For days, Greta continued to turn the problem over in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the pineapple, the juice, and the way it had made her feel. There had been something almost tender about the way the Americans had offered it to them, as if they were giving them something that they had no obligation to provide. But the feeling of tenderness was also unsettling. It made her question everything she had believed about the enemy. She had been taught to see them as ruthless and inhuman, yet here they were, showing a kindness that she didn't know how to interpret. It was in these moments of quiet reflection that Greta realized something important. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the larger question of survival. The way they had been treated in this camp, however strange and foreign, was a reminder that survival was not always about fighting back or resisting at every turn. Sometimes survival meant adapting, accepting the unexpected, and finding a way to coexist with those who were once seen as enemies. It wasn't an easy truth to swallow, but it was the reality they were facing now. Greta's thoughts were interrupted when Sergeant Riley came into the barracks one evening to speak with her. He seemed to be trying to strike a balance between professionalism and humanity, but his presence only reminded her of the division that still existed between them. "I hope you are finding things to your liking," he said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "If you have any requests or concerns, you can bring them to me." Greta nodded, though she couldn't bring herself to speak. She had been reluctant to speak to any of the Americans, not because she hated them, but because she didn't know how to reconcile their treatment of her with the image she had of them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about identity. Who were they now, in this strange place, caught between their past and present? Could they remain true to themselves while adapting to a world that seemed determined to change them? Later that evening, after Riley had left, Greta sat alone in the dim light of the barracks. She thought back to her life in Hamburg, to the people she had known, before the war had shattered everything. She remembered the pride she had felt as a teacher, the sense of purpose in her work. Now all of that seemed so distant, so unreachable. She wondered if she could ever go back to who she had been before the war, or if the woman she had been would be forever lost in this new reality. It was then that she realized something else, something that frightened her even more. The war had taken so much from them, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of identity. They had been stripped of their homes, their families, their nation. And now, here they were, trying to hold on to something that might not even exist anymore. Could they return to the people they had been before? Or had the war already changed them too much? Greta stood up, her body stiff from sitting for too long. She walked over to the small window of the barracks, looking out into the camp. The night air was cold, but it felt refreshing against her face. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. She would have to make a choice. Whether she wanted to or not, the war had already forced them all to change. Now it was up to her to decide how she would change in response. As the days turned into weeks, the tension that had once gripped the camp began to slowly dissipate. The German women, who had initially resisted the kindness they had been shown, started to adapt to their new reality. It wasn't an easy transition, but the simple acts of care and civility extended by the American guards and camp staff began to make an impact. The food, once met with suspicion, was now being eaten without hesitation. Each meal, no matter how basic, became a small act of survival, a reminder that they had been given the chance to live, even if in captivity. Greta found herself grappling with her own conflicting emotions. She had come to the camp determined to resist, to hold on to her sense of identity and pride as a German woman. But the warmth, however small, that she had experienced in the camp was beginning to soften her resistance. It was as if the kindness had found its way into her heart, gradually breaking down the walls she had so carefully built around herself. She wasn't sure if she should be grateful or ashamed for letting her guard down, but the truth was undeniable. She was beginning to accept the situation for what it was. One morning, as they sat down for breakfast, Greta noticed the other women were speaking more openly. The awkward silences that had once filled the mess hall were being replaced with tentative conversations. It was clear that, despite their initial reluctance, they were beginning to bond with their American captors in small ways. Some women would exchange smiles with the guards, while others would thank the cooks for the meals. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The human connections that had once seemed impossible were now slowly being forged. Greta couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short period. It had only been a few weeks since they had arrived, yet the camp felt less like a place of punishment and more like a strange sort of refuge. The fear and mistrust had been replaced by a quiet understanding. Even though they were still prisoners, they were no longer viewed as mere enemies. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, and it made all the difference. At night, Greta and the other women would gather in their barracks where they had begun to hold informal study sessions. The language barrier that had once been an obstacle was now a challenge they were determined to overcome. Greta took it upon herself to teach the others basic English, and they spent hours practicing vocabulary and simple phrases. It wasn't much, but it gave them a sense of purpose, a way to reclaim some control over their lives. Learning a new language was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was a step toward understanding a world that had once felt foreign and hostile. As the weeks went by, Greta began to see the women's personalities emerge in new ways. Anna-Marie, who had once been the most resistant to the idea of cooperation, was now helping others with their lessons, her sharp mind becoming an invaluable asset to the group. Liesl, the youngest of the women, had taken to exploring the camp with an eagerness that made Greta smile. She saw in Liesl a kind of curiosity that was infectious, a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there was room for hope and discovery. Despite the slow shift in their attitudes, there were still moments of discomfort. The fruit and juice that had once seemed so strange and out of place were now accepted as part of their daily routine. But every time they were served pineapple or orange juice, there was a brief hesitation, a reminder of how far they had come in such a short time. Greta had long since stopped questioning the kindness behind the meals, but the memory of their initial reaction remained. It was as if the fruit had marked a turning point, a moment when they realized that they could no longer hold on to their old notions of what it meant to be an enemy. One evening, as the women sat together after dinner, Greta found herself talking to Sam, the camp's cook. He had been one of the few American soldiers who had shown them any real warmth from the beginning, and now, as she spoke to him, she realized how much he had influenced her perception of the camp. "Sam," she said quietly, "I never imagined this. I never imagined that we would be treated this way." Sam looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's easy to forget that everyone here is human. We're not so different, after all. We've all been through things we'd rather forget, but that doesn't mean we can't be decent to each other. That doesn't mean we can't find a way to survive, even together." Greta nodded, absorbing his words. She had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten what it meant to be truly human. She had thought that survival was about fighting, about holding on to your pride at all costs. But now, she saw that survival was about something deeper, about finding a way to exist in a world that didn't make sense, about learning to live with others, even when they were once your enemies. The next day, as they sat down to another meal, Greta found herself looking at the food differently. It wasn't just a meal anymore. It was a gesture, a symbol of the care they had begun to accept. The fruit no longer felt like a mockery. It felt like something that could sustain them, both physically and emotionally. As she ate, she realized that she had started to let go of the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do for a long time. As the days passed, the camp became a place where the lines between enemy and ally began to blur. Greta saw it in the small moments, the way the women began to share stories of their homes, the way the guards offered them extra blankets during the cold nights, the way they all started to look out for one another. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was enough to remind her that, even in captivity, there was still room for compassion. Greta knew that the war was still going on, that the world outside the camp was still a place of violence and uncertainty. But here, in this small corner of the world, there was something different happening. They were learning to live again, to accept the kindness of strangers, and to offer kindness in return. And though it was hard, though it challenged everything she had once believed, Greta knew that this was the only way forward, through understanding, through acceptance, and through the simple act of surviving together. The atmosphere in the camp had shifted noticeably. What had once been a tense, uncomfortable space filled with unspoken animosities was slowly becoming something else, a space where people, even enemies, could find moments of mutual respect. Greta could feel the change, but she still wasn't sure how to categorize it. The distance between the women and their American captors was narrowing, but it wasn't a friendship in the traditional sense. Instead, it was something more complex, an understanding born from shared experience, however unlikely it seemed. It had been almost 3 months since their arrival at Camp Alona, and each day brought more unexpected moments. Some of the women had even begun to laugh again, something Greta had not seen in a long time. It wasn't the forced laughter of those trying to hide their fear or sorrow, but genuine, unburdened laughter. It was a rare sound, but it brought with it a feeling of fragile hope. The darkness of the past still lingered, but now it was being pushed back by small acts of humanity. Greta had started to notice the subtle shifts in her own emotions as well. When she first arrived, she had been filled with nothing but distrust and fear, determined to maintain her distance from the Americans who held them captive. But now, she found herself questioning her initial assumptions. Every day, the boundaries between her and the guards seemed to blur just a little more. She had seen Sergeant Riley smile at one of the younger women, had heard a quiet conversation between a guard and one of the prisoners as they discussed English lessons. It was nothing grand, but it was enough to make her question the idea that all enemies were inherently cruel. But it wasn't just the guards who were changing. The women, too, were evolving. Their daily routines had become less about surviving and more about living. The lessons in English had become a point of pride. They weren't just learning a new language, they were rebuilding something they had lost. They were beginning to communicate, to share thoughts and ideas that went beyond the basic needs of survival. Greta could see how much it meant to them, the simple ability to speak freely, even if their words were still clumsy. The sense of empowerment that came from these lessons was palpable. One evening, after a particularly lively session, Greta sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset. The air was cool, but the sky was painted with warm colors, orange, pink, and purple. It was a beautiful sight, one that seemed so out of place in the harsh world they had been thrust into. She found herself thinking about the past, about the world she had left behind in Germany. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given her the chance to learn something new, to see people, even those she once considered enemies, as fellow human beings. It was during this time that Sam, the camp's cook, approached her. He had become a regular presence in their lives, and though their interactions had been limited, there was a quiet understanding between them. Sam had always been kind to the women, but he had never tried to force a connection. He simply offered them food, and with it, small gestures of respect. It was in this way that he had earned their trust. "Greta," Sam said one evening, his voice hesitant but warm, "I've been thinking. You've done so much for these women, helping them with the language, guiding them through this. I think it's time it's time I show you how to make cornbread. My grandmother taught me, and I think it might be something that brings us all together." Greta looked at him, surprised by the offer. She had never expected anything like this. In a way, it felt like an invitation to bridge the final gap between them, an offer of shared humanity through something as simple as food. "You'd teach me?" she asked, her voice soft. "Of course," Sam replied, his face breaking into a smile. "It's not just about the food. It's about sharing something real. You've seen how food brings people together in this camp. It's the simplest thing, but it matters." That night, Greta went with Sam to the kitchen. The act of making cornbread, something so simple and yet so filled with history, felt like an act of connection. As Sam showed her the steps, mixing the cornmeal, adding the water, and carefully pouring the batter into the pan, Greta felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about learning to trust, to share something that had once been foreign. They spent hours in the kitchen, laughing and talking, and for the first time, Greta felt at ease with the man who had once been an enemy. There was no longer any pretense between them. They were simply two people, connected through the act of making food, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. As the bread baked in the oven, Greta sat down and looked at Sam. "You know," she said, "I never imagined that this is how we would end up. I thought we would always be enemies, but now I see it differently." Sam nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. "Sometimes you have to step outside of what you know. You have to realize that there's more to people than the uniforms they wear or the flags they fly. We're all just trying to survive in our own way." That night, as Greta went to bed, she reflected on everything that had happened in the camp. They had started as enemies, but now they were something else, something she couldn't quite define. They were survivors, yes, but more than that, they were learning to be human again. The walls that had once divided them were slowly crumbling, and in their place, new connections were being forged, one small moment at a time. In the weeks that followed, Greta and the other women began to experience more moments of connection, both with each other and with the Americans who had once been their captors. The food, once a symbol of their captivity, became something more, a symbol of shared survival, of shared humanity. And in that simple act of sharing, they found a new strength, one that transcended the divisions that had once seemed so insurmountable. For Greta, it was a turning point. She had started this journey with fear and suspicion in her heart, and now she found herself looking at the world differently. The war was not over, and there was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that there was hope, not just for survival, but for something more, a possibility for peace, however fragile it might be. And in that quiet moment, as she lay in her bed, Greta knew that they had taken the first step toward building something new, something that would outlast the war itself.